Hello and welcome to Blockchain News. It's another episode with my wing lady, Chloe White. She's been jet setting around the globe again, and she's joining me from beautiful Melbourne. Chloe, welcome back.
Really good to see you again.
Yeah, it's awesome to see you. We're a bit snuffly. I think everybody in Australia has some form of flu or COVID right now.
Yeah, fortunately, my rat test is negative, but it's still not fun to be feeling congested, but it's nice to visit Australia.
Awesome. Now, I said blockchain news, but I think I'm going to have to change the title of this show, because when we were doing our kind of research and chats around the content of it, every episode we seem to get closer and closer, and our two worlds seem to be coming almost one.
Absolutely, Dex. This is a conversation that we started having in Singapore last year.
Yeah.
And I think for both of us, our conviction in that position has really grown this year. And I've just had a really interesting tour of Canberra, talking to members of parliament and members of the bureaucracy. And I'm more convinced than I've ever been that there's a conversation to be had about emerging technologies and about the digital economy. But these lines are becoming increasingly blurred between what we call blockchain, fintech, other emerging tech, and what the digital economy could look like and should look like.
Awesome. Now, you mentioned there Canberra, been some really interesting conversations that you've been part of. What can you share with us, Chloe?
So I went down to Canberra and had a series of conversations with public servants across all the so-called central agencies, senior executives and directors who work across these different issues and economic policy as well, for some high-level perspective and conversation. And it was really nice to go and be back in the parliamentary triangle, be up on the hill in Parliament House, and reconnecting with a lot of former colleagues and meeting new people as well. The tone in Australia has been fairly flat for a little while now. And I always notice when I'm visiting or speaking with Australians that there is not as much energy or momentum in this market as in some other parts of the world. And so I wasn't really sure what to expect from the conversations down in Canberra. I want to share with you the good, the bad, and the ugly of really what came out of my week there. But I will say overall, I did leave Canberra seeing the shimmer of hope and things that we could all do better. All the different stakeholders involved in the digital economy transition. So it did inspire me and energize me, but it certainly, I think, for me, helped to draw out where we have to have some really honest and difficult conversations with ourselves in the industry about the changes that we need to make and the conversations that we need to start having that we haven't really been doing.
Was there anything that kind of stood out to you, that it's probably an immediate change that needs to happen?
I think the overarching conclusion for me is we need to accept the reality, and this is now talking from a blockchain point of view, that there are no blockchain conversations. They simply don't exist. They're not happening. Nobody's having them. It's very, I think, frustrating for a lot of people who consider themselves to be in the blockchain industry because they feel that they've always been the ugly child of the emerging technology family, the one that's, somehow overhyped while also being underestimated. They're never understood. They feel drowned out by influences and scandals. They feel that they have a lot to contribute, but they feel that there's never any cut through and nobody's really listening to them. And so I think a natural reaction that a lot of passionate enthusiasts and builders have to that is to say, well, we need people to listen to us and we need people to hear our story. But there really is no room for a conversation. And so if there is no blockchain conversation, what is the conversation? What is the narrative? What do we build meetings and collaborations and events around? And so to me, and this is, I think, the big theme for us, Dex, is it's about understanding how all these emerging technologies and digital economy issues, Web 2 and Web 3, fit together and sit in the priority list for the government. And if your goal and your objective is to shift government and help them help you by influencing them and informing and educating them, the only way to have an effective conversation is to do it in a holistic way. You need to have that helicopter perspective and not make the issue all about your niche passion, because that is simply falling on deaf ears.
It's interesting you say that, because if I look at the journey that fintech's been on, and I go back to 2017, 2018, where things really started to get some momentum, seeing the emergence of neobanks, government support. We had at the time the Treasurer, who then became the Prime Minister, big support for fintech. We had the Royal Commission, and I think really the Royal Commission was the thing that created the momentum. Do you kind of get a similar kind of sense, that there could be an opportunity for the blockchain community to start fixing some of these problems around the consumer focus, to then start to get an audience with the government, to then start to have the innovation discussion, to then start to have initiatives like CDR push through, and kind of get, major political will behind it?
It absolutely is possible. Let's understand what has happened so that we can understand where we are. And you just reflected on Scott Morrison's leadership as Treasurer. His passion and enthusiasm for fintech and competition in Australian banking always struck me as being quite genuine. And through his actions, I think he showed that he had this real enthusiasm for that competition. He did establish his own advisory group with participants from the private sector, and was known to always be putting it on the agenda, even in other rooms and other conversations. When he then became the Prime Minister, obviously he had a much broader remit, and so his attention was stretched. We then had Josh Frydenberg as Treasurer, who maybe didn't style himself quite so much as being this tech-savvy kind of guy, and was focused on different issues. We were at that time as well, pre-COVID. And so the historical, economic and political context at that time was all set up quite well for Australians to feel bullish about fintech and blockchain. Now we're in a very different climate where really concerned about macroeconomic factors, cybersecurity. We've got a lot of Web 2 policy questions that still haven't been resolved. We've had a complete overhaul of the government. We have a Labor government in power now. So what do we do? Where do we go from here? So I think recognizing that there is still confusion about the merits of distributed ledger technology. How does it fit into an emerging technology stack? And then just thinking about any financial sector issues generally, or any technology sector issues generally. Finance and technology are generally not viewed upon as parts of the economy that are particularly in need of help or support. In terms of how we can position ourselves being adjacent to more interesting, trending policy areas, there's a lot of focus globally now on AI policy. Australia never reacts in quite as big a way to these sorts of events as what we see in the US and Europe. But to the extent that we recognise that in Canberra, they generally do like to take cues from, Five Eyes and like-minded countries, we can at least point to some of those international trends and say, hey, so there's this thing on the horizon, AI policy. We want to have some Australian conversations about that. AI is very relevant to fintech. To tie this all together, what I find helpful in my conversations and how I'm thinking about the future direction of the space is to think, how do all of these technologies and platforms integrate in the future? What are the platforms, products and services that will be offered to retail and institutional markets and to governments as well. And so what we see are the challenges that arise from that complexity. And that's when you start to identify what the policy questions are. And that's when you can start to talk about solutions. And that's what government is interested in. They want you to bring solutions to them. It's great to raise problems, but governments want to know that you as an industry are not just going to them to have a whinge. You're going to them because you want some kind of reform, and you can actually articulate what that reform is and why it's helpful to all of the stakeholders, and that you're not just operating from a position of rent seeking.
You're kind of right. I remember having this chat with pretty much every politician that I know who's, if I can give, what advice have you got for founders? Come to us with a solution, not with a problem. Right, you guys are the entrepreneurs, right? We're looking to you to fix it, not for us to fix it. And I think this is where, there's a few challenges I think we've got in Oz. One is we've got too many industry bodies that all have different voices that are coming from different angles of the same story, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you have to have one coordinated voice of who's making the decision.
Okay, you just said a lot of great stuff. I think I'm going to pick up the point about the industry association coordination.
Yeah.
Australia is a very small market. So the fact that we do have a lot of quite small industry associations can mean that efforts are diluted. And that's why coordination is so important. I think we could afford to see more coordination of industry associations in this country that do have similar goals and overlapping objectives. So that's certainly another example of how we could strengthen our position in terms of how we communicate compelling positions to government. And I want to make clear, it's not the case that you can't find any members of parliament or members of the government or members of the bureaucracy who are lacking curiosity or completely disinterested in this stuff. That's not the case. I went and spoke on a live stream where I did an hour Q&A about blockchain to an audience of public servants on my first day of my Canberra visit. We had over 100 public servants dial in for the live stream, and the Q&A chat was going crazy. There was so much engagement of that conversation. Yeah. There is an interest, but when it comes down to those decisions that the party needs to make at the highest level around, what's going to be our 3-word slogan for the next election, or what are going to be our top 3 issues that we push at the next election.
Yeah.
It's so hard to tell a compelling story to the general public about these nuanced, complex issues that don't resonate in quite the same way as healthcare and education, these other issues. So, and again, there's been just very realistic about the politics that we face.
Nobody's actually putting any investment into these great ideas that get built when you're in a downturn. Everybody is focused on mission critical, reactive stuff, as you've pointed out. The challenge now becomes, at what point is somebody brave enough, and who is that person or who is that group that's then brave enough to go, hey, here's the step into the next world, the next kind of evolution of technology. We talk about this stuff like happening, and everybody about these Cambrian explosions. The Cambrian period lasted for over 500,000 years, right? It wasn't an overnight thing whereby, and I think we kind of talk about these technologies like it's going to be overnight. This type of evolution takes decades and decades and decades. And unfortunately, at this moment in time, there isn't anybody who's prepared to put money behind something that is going to pay off potentially in 1 decade or 2 decades' time. Which interestingly is why the neobanks failed, was because these were decades-long plays and the capital, there just wasn't the investment risk appetite. People want to see a return much quicker than that.
The Commonwealth Bank has been participating in the RBA's CBDC pilots, and a representative from the bank, a good friend of mine, reported a few days ago, they have determined that through their pilot that they did, involving splitting payments between a service provider and the ATO using smart contracts. They estimate that if this were implemented at scale, it could save Australia $1.5 billion per year in fraud and administration.
Wow.
That's not something to ignore. Anybody who does anything where they're investing resources in this space is brave in this environment, Dex. And I think that because Australia does have a tendency to be quite inward looking, and we often forget to look out and see what's happening elsewhere in the world, we are missing some of the, I think, threats and opportunities on the horizon in that global sense. And so that is why we do tend to be a little bit of a laggard, or at best a fast follower. When we're sufficiently inspired by the UK, or something. But so I think that we need to do a better job of communicating these types of examples that are very tangible, that they're quantitative, and they are sensible, and they may not have all of the hype and attraction of some of the more degen use cases, but they're able to be taken seriously by the audience that we want to convince. But again, it needs to be wrapped in a broader context. It needs to be talked about in the context of regtech and digital economy, and not be just a blockchain story. There is still a brain drain that Australia is suffering at the moment, and this is even despite the fact that there have been so many layoffs in tech over the past 12 months. So we need to also be realistic about the fact that Australia's simply not going to be the appropriate market or the ideal market for every single business model. There may simply be some products and services that are not suited. And so it comes down to founders being realistic with themselves as well about, you may feel very passionate about your product or your business, and it may well be a fantastic idea, but Australia may not be the right launch market, or it may simply just not be the right time for you to focus on this jurisdiction.
I think that's the other sad thing that we're seeing is, businesses withdrawing now from Australia who, come in a year or two ago, which isn't good news, and it's not a good story to sell from an investment perspective. But on that point that you've talked about talent, I mean, this is, the biggest frustration that I've got. And unfortunately in Australia, I think the approach that we've got to talent is very much around just buying ready-made solution, has to tick every single box. Not even clarity around what those boxes are and their relevance to actually determining the outcomes that you're looking for. What's your sense around this brain drain that you talked about, and how do we go about fixing that?
I was very honest in my conversations with Parliament about the brain drain, and it's an opportunity that is lost when we see really talented Australians going overseas and creating jobs overseas and building wealth overseas, creating value offshore. That's a lost opportunity for Australia. But again, let's look at the macro context. Australia's unemployment rate is currently 3.5%. That's a very tight labour market. Yeah. So when we talk about jobs and growth, what is it that we're actually trying to sell a solution here? So I think it is a conversation about productivity more so than jobs as such. And what that means is that we're thinking about people who are employed now, but could be producing more, operating more efficiently, because technology is augmenting their ability to produce output, to put all of this in crude economic terms. So I think that is an appealing angle to an economist. But again, when we're thinking about the priorities of the current Australian government, we don't necessarily want to come at this from a pure economic angle either. What we want to do is say, well, this is really about talent, and focusing on the benefits of investing in education for all different stakeholders in the economy. And education, again, is one of those eternal themes of Australian politics where everybody agrees that it's important to get it right, we dial up and down how much we focus on it, depending on who's in power. But taking the framing and the rhetoric of education really to kind of, I think, communicate this message that, we know that the technology is here and it's going to grow. And we know that it comes with a bunch of challenges and opportunities. Education can be a tool and a policy approach that actually helps us to navigate that and get the most out of it.
Yeah. And look, I think that's probably one area where all the industry bodies here in Oz, I think, can do a better job, particularly around the talent and the education piece. And maybe they haven't had to because of the previous government. But as you and I both know, when we've talked about what wins votes with a Labour government is jobs and education and the focus on people and their welfare. We've gone from capitalism to socialism, and I think we need to, kind of step with that, and all of the stigma and recognize the stigmas that come with the tech industry and blockchain industry and crypto, and how they're very much kind of polarizing to a Labour government that's very much around doctors, nurses, welfare and supporting those that most need it.
There's another important reason, I think, why we need to focus on education now. And that's, I think, because we're missing an opportunity to partner with the educators that we have in Australia and have them as partners to help tell our stories to government.
Yeah.
When I look at how other jurisdictions around the world have progressed further than we have, I see that there are 4 different models. Let's start with the UK. They established a multi-agency task force, kind of like a tiger team. They brought together public servants from different departments who worked throughout the bull and bear market. And that's the ideal approach. You don't get distracted or lose focus just because the issue falls off the front page. And that's how they were able to get out really thorough guidance on issues that were important to the industry a long time before we were able to get new consultation papers issued here. So that's an attractive model. Is it politically realistic at the moment in Australia? I would say no. There's not a widespread agreement in Canberra that they want to devote that significant of an amount of their bureaucratic resources. So let's hold that up as a gold standard, but say that's not where Australia's headed over the next 6 to 12 months at least. Let's turn to Singapore. Again, they were one of the first countries to legislate in a way that was not just about ICOs, but they were slow to implement. They focused on a few narrow but important areas. Then they became stricter on a couple of issues after observing the market's behavior. Not a bad approach. They got an early mover advantage. Then they were able to refine as they saw. They did have a wave of hype and then disillusionment from the point of view of the private sector, but they've actually positioned themselves fairly good. If you look at where they stand today, it's too late to follow that model now because the first mover advantage has dissipated. So that's a little bit of kind of, okay, lesson learned for the future, but isn't going to work now. Then we have a kind of more progressive approach that we see in Dubai, where they worked very closely with entrepreneurs in the industry. They took their concerns seriously. They built a bespoke regime without overthinking the interplay between, but we have, TradFi laws and crypto regulations and how are they going to fit together? They just went ahead, they built it, they administered it. That approach has never been given serious attention in Australia. And I think that within the Treasury portfolio, there has been an attachment to technology neutrality that has prevented the Treasury from wanting to explore this. The technology neutrality principle is really important, but I think that the assumptions underlying it have never really been tested or even debated. It's become a bit of an ideology that shuts down conversations quite early on whenever you try to open up conversation about more left of field options. And so I don't think that we would suggest that the Dubai approach is going to cut through in that environment, right? But I put it up for the sake of contrast. But the fourth model, which I think is the one that's most realistic for where Australia is at the moment, is the European Union. They acted slowly in a highly bureaucratic environment and system. They built out a reasonably prescriptive regime, but covers large swathes of the sector's activities and business models. But how they did that was they chipped away at it by working with academics and researchers, and they relied on those trusted voices to help inform decision making. So it wasn't like Dubai where they really were so open to talking to the industry, because Dubai is very business leaning and business oriented. But in the European Union, you can see that with those close partnerships they had with academia, they were able to get the outcome. And now they have legislated the MiCA regime. So I think that the most realistic opportunity in Australia under the current government is something that resembles the European Union approach. You need to be able to build on incremental progress. You need to have these trusted voices that can help to facilitate and lead, frankly, the conversation. Researchers have a much greater role to play in the policy process. And I think Australia really needs platforms that bring together policymakers and the academic community, because when I was in Canberra talking about some of the research that academics are doing in this space, a lot of people that I spoke to in Canberra didn't even realize there was an academic community doing research on this technology. Yeah. They don't even know that it exists. So we need to think about education not only as a policy solution, but as a critical stakeholder that's actually an important partner, but the industry hasn't really leveraged even a fraction of its potential.
So, Chloe, we've talked a lot today about some of the kind of challenges facing the industry. It's been great to just kind of have an offload of, what you've experienced at Canberra, and I get a sense that you kind of got similar frustrations to me as well. And I'm the type of person that's action oriented, and I know you're the same type of person as me. So, what kind of solutions have you got?
We always have to bring it back to solutions, Dexter. Otherwise, what are we doing?
Solutions. Yeah.
And look, my intention is certainly not to have a rant. I've played therapist to so many frustrated members of the community, leaders of the community, who simply don't have the experience of dealing with the policy process and with the bureaucracy. And in Australia, Canberra can feel like a bubble. And, I know that a lot of Australians do often feel that government ministries are out of touch with their needs and their challenges. So, what I want to offer to the industry is a perspective that we do need to do a little bit of honest self-reflection, but only for the purposes of being able to hit the reset button and look to the future and say, what can we do differently? And so I have a few conclusions that I want to share, and I'm going to talk about what I personally would like to do to contribute to the solution, but I would encourage everybody to think about what opportunities they have to get involved as well. And I would love to collaborate with people who share this solution-oriented perspective. I have 3 points to make. The first one is if you approach a policy dialogue from a position of rent seeking and you're uncoordinated and out of step with other industry leaders or bodies or what have you, researchers, academics, your message is going to fall on deaf ears. We need to bear in mind, many economists still expect that a recession is looming. And although Australia, the lucky country, is, currently projecting a budget surplus and unemployment is low, the uncertainty of the macroeconomic environment that we face multiplies or magnifies the need for a united front. And we need to keep the conversation solutions oriented, because there simply is not enough airtime for us to talk about our pet peeves and our passion projects. We really need to get smart. So that's the first point. So then what are we going to do differently from here on? I think the time has come for multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral approaches to shine. And this is not about integrating blockchain into every platform that we can identify for the sake of adoption. But as the line blurs between technology and finance and industry verticals, and we've got AI and this, we're sitting on the cusp of this digital revolution. And as you said earlier, Dexter, it took decades for the internet to show up with understandable use cases. We need to be patient, but we need new policy frameworks. That's what government needs to make sense of this structural reform. And another really great point that you made is that this is really hard. We tend to think of policymakers and governments as these all-knowing gods who, if only they would take pity on us, they would implement the right reform.
Yeah.
Nobody knows the magical solution to a lot of these complex issues. And we have to be willing to bring forward some ideas that actually will provide them with a solution as well. Make it as easy as possible for them to say yes to by minimizing the risks.
Yeah, absolutely.
What does that look like in practice? I think let's be super pragmatic. We need new forums, fresh voices. We need to have balanced and constructive curation of conversations, building for the better. So coming now to, okay, how am I personally going to try and contribute to this? There's a couple of initiatives that are close to my heart that I'm going to be putting more energy into. How I am trying to coordinate in Australia at the moment is through my pro bono support that I provide to Blockchain Australia. What I'm doing over the coming period is chairing Blockchain Australia's Digital Assets Working Group. This working group has just been rebooted. And as my deputy chair, I'm going to be working with Paul Stoneham from the ASX. And so together, we're going to be helping Blockchain Australia to advocate for better policy frameworks and coordinating with other working groups. And this is all a volunteer effort. So I would really encourage anybody who's interested in getting involved to reach out to myself and Paul. It is a Blockchain Australia initiative, so you do need to be a member of the industry association to participate, but that's the only requirement to be eligible to join the working group. We are already looking to put together our first submission. And so this is a
fantastic.
This is a working group that has had one introductory meeting recently, but we're still getting into ramp up mode. So it's certainly not too late to hop on board and start to put ideas forward. The second thing that I'm really excited about over the next 6 months is my team will be helping to curate and coordinate an international conference that will be coming to Sydney in November. And this is really about creating a forum that brings together expert researchers, globally recognized academics, and getting policymakers in the room. I very enthusiastically discussed this idea with a lot of people that I spoke to in Canberra, and they were really keen to participate in the event. The conference is going to be called Block 9. A website will be built in the next couple of months, and we'll start promoting the event more. But this is not about influencers. It's not an Australian blockchain conference. It's an international conference that's happening in Australia. And so we're going to have, world-renowned researchers. And again, this is not just about blockchain. These are cryptographers. These are TradFi people. This is a room of relevant, adjacent colleagues who will be coming in from multiple continents to collaborate. And so I'm really looking forward to this event. I hope that you'll be there, Dex. I'm inviting.
Absolutely. Yeah, it sounds amazing. In fact, I'm gonna now label this the Cyboss of blockchain. You right, heard it here first. This is where it's gonna be. First one here in Sydney. Amazing.
Super exciting.
Chloe, it's been fantastic. Yeah, it's been fantastic to chat with you. Thanks for the update on everything. Where can people find out more about Genesis Block Advisory, and how do they reach out to you?
I'm across LinkedIn and Twitter. I also have my website, genesisblock.com.au. If you click through the links there, you'll find all my socials. Send me a DM or ask for an introduction.
Awesome. And as always, you can catch up with me on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you're new to the show, make sure you give us a follow and a like, and leave a review and comment. It really helps us promote the show to other people like yourself. And if you're coming back, thanks so much for your support. Until the next episode, keep well.